Throughout the course of intellectual history, the relationship between human subjectivity and external reality has remained a pivotal and contested terrain of philosophical inquiry. From the earliest formulations of metaphysical speculation to contemporary theoretical frameworks, the question of how individuals come to know the world, and more significantly, how they interpret and constitute that knowledge, continues to challenge conventional epistemological boundaries. This enduring preoccupation with the nature of perception, cognition, and representation is not merely an abstract concern, but one that resonates deeply within the socio-political structures that govern our everyday lives. Indeed, the modes through which knowledge is constructed and disseminated are never ideologically neutral. They are always embedded within broader configurations of power language and historical contingency. The development of modernity, particularly from the Enlightenment onwards, brought with it a profound reconfiguration of the subject's relation to knowledge and the world. Enlightenment rationality sought to ground truth in the universality of reason, privileging objectivity and empirical verification as the cornerstones of legitimate knowledge production. Yet beneath this ostensibly neutral framework lay a host of exclusions, silences, and erasures. The epistemic structures developed in this era systematically privileged certain forms of knowing, those rooted in Eurocentric masculine and capitalist logics, while marginalizing or rendering invisible alternative epistemologies. This dynamic produced what philosopher Michel Foucault later termed regimes of truth, historically contingent systems in which particular discourses acquire the authority to define what counts as truth, thereby delineating the limits of the sayable and the thinkable. In the 20th century, critical theorists began to dismantle these presumptions of objectivity and universalism. Thinkers such as Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and later post-structuralists like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault interrogated the ideological underpinnings of modern rationality. They highlighted how knowledge is never innocent, but rather always implicated in systems of domination. Foucault's archaeological and genealogical methods, for instance, sought to reveal the historical contingencies and power relations that underpin the emergence of specific discourses. Rather than treating knowledge as a stable, neutral mirror of reality, Foucault proposed that knowledge is fundamentally productive. It creates the subjects it purports merely to describe, and in doing so, organizes the field of possible action, behavior, and belief. This turn toward the political dimension of knowledge production has been taken up with renewed urgency in contemporary debates surrounding identity representation and decolonization. Scholars working within feminist, queer, and post-colonial frameworks have expanded upon the insights of critical theory to demonstrate how marginalized groups have been systematically excluded from the domain of legitimate knowledge producers. Feminist epistemologists, for instance, have argued for the concept of situated knowledge, emphasizing the partial, embodied, and context-dependent nature of all epistemic claims. Donna Haraway, in her influential essay, Situated Knowledges, The Science Question in Feminism and the Privilege of Partial Perspective, contends that objectivity cannot be achieved through disembodied neutrality, but rather through an acknowledgement of one's position within specific social and historical matrices. Similarly, post-colonial theorists such as Gayatri Spivak and Homi K. Bhabha have illuminated the ways in which colonial power structures continue to shape the global epistemic landscape. Spivak's critique of the epistemic violence inflicted upon subaltern subjects raises vital questions about who gets to speak, who is heard, and whose knowledge is deemed credible within dominant discursive frameworks. Her famous query, "Can the subaltern speak?" is not merely rhetorical. It underscores the structural barriers that inhibit the articulation of marginalized voices within hegemonic systems of meaning. Bhabha, meanwhile, explores the hybridity and ambivalence inherent in post-colonial subjectivity, revealing the instability of cultural identity and the performative nature of representation. These critiques are not merely academic exercises, they have profound implications for how we understand and engage with the world. In an era marked by growing skepticism toward institutions of knowledge, be they scientific, journalistic, or educational, there is a pressing need to critically examine the epistemological assumptions that underlie public discourse. The proliferation of digital technologies, the rise of misinformation, and the erosion of consensus reality have only intensified the urgency of such inquiry. In this context, the politics of knowledge becomes not only an intellectual concern, but a matter of democratic survival. The question is no longer simply what is true, but rather who has the power to define what is true and to what ends. Moreover, the emergence of intersectionality as both an analytical tool and a political imperative has further complicated traditional epistemologies. Originally developed by Kimberly Crenshaw to address the ways in which race and gender intersect in legal and social analysis, intersectionality has since become a crucial framework for understanding the multiplicity of oppressions that shape individual and collective experience. By emphasizing the interlocking nature of systems such as racism, patriarchy, capitalism, and colonialism, intersectionality challenges reductive or single-axis modes of analysis. It insists on the need to account for the complexity and specificity of lived experience, an insistence that in turn necessitates a more nuanced and reflexive approach to knowledge production. In this light, the concept of epistemic justice has gained traction as a way to frame struggles over representation, voice, and credibility. Philosopher Miranda Fricker identifies two main forms of epistemic injustice testimonial. Injustice, which occurs when a speaker's credibility is unjustly deflated due to prejudice, and hermeneutical injustice, which arises when marginalized groups lack the conceptual resources to make sense of their experiences within dominant frameworks. These forms of injustice are not merely communicative failures, they are deeply political acts that reinforce existing hierarchies and perpetuate exclusion. Addressing epistemic injustice thus requires not only changes in discourse, but transformations in the material and institutional conditions under which knowledge is produced and circulated. Yet, even as critical theory seeks to dismantle oppressive epistemologies, it must grapple with its own limitations. The academy itself isn't immune to the very exclusions it seeks to critique. Institutions of higher education have historically functioned as gatekeepers of elite knowledge, often reproducing the very hierarchies they purport to challenge. This paradox has led to calls for a decolonization of the curriculum aimed at disrupting Eurocentric canons and incorporating diverse epistemic traditions. Such efforts are not merely about inclusion or representation, they are about fundamentally rethinking the foundations of knowledge and authority. Decolonial thinkers, especially those from the global south, have emphasized the need to move beyond Western paradigms, entirely advocating for epistemologies rooted in indigenous cosmologies, ancestral wisdom, and relational ontologies. Walter Mignolo's concept of the coloniality of power outlines how colonialism persists not merely through political or economic dominance, but through the imposition of epistemic hierarchies that continue to devalue non-Western ways of knowing. Similarly, Boaventura de Sousa Santos has proposed the idea of an ecology of knowledges in which different epistemological systems are recognized as coexisting and mutually enriching rather than being ranked in a hierarchy of development or sophistication. This epistemic pluralism poses significant challenges to dominant academic methodologies, which often rely on assumptions of universality and replicability. It requires a humility that is often absent from positivist approaches, a recognition that no single framework can capture the full complexity of human experience. At the same time, it demands vigilance against the romanticization of alternative epistemologies, which can inadvertently reinforce essentialist or static notions of culture. The goal then is not to replace one dominant system with another, but to cultivate a critical openness to multiplicity, contradiction, and incompleteness. Building upon the imperative to recognize and embrace epistemic plurality, one must also contend with the practical challenges involved in enacting such a transformation within contemporary knowledge systems. The institutional structures that govern academic and scientific inquiry are often deeply entrenched, reinforced by bureaucratic norms, funding mechanisms, and entrenched disciplinary boundaries that resist fundamental change. The reproduction of dominant epistemologies is not simply a matter of individual bias or ignorance. It is sustained through systemic processes that confer legitimacy and authority upon particular forms of knowledge while marginalizing others. This entrenchment manifests in the standardization of methodologies, the privileging of quantitative data over qualitative insights, and the codification of what counts as valid evidence. Yet despite these obstacles, numerous scholars and activists have undertaken the difficult work of reimagining the possibilities of knowledge production in ways that center marginalized perspectives and epistemologies. These efforts often involve challenging conventional epistemic hierarchies and fostering dialogic spaces where multiple knowledges can intersect, interact, and coalesce without being subordinated to a dominant framework. In doing so, they disrupt the conventional binaries of expert versus layperson theory versus practice and universal versus particular. This democratization of knowledge challenges the notion that expertise is the sole province of credentialed professionals and instead values lived experience, community-based wisdom, and collaborative inquiry. One significant manifestation of this epistemic democratization is the rise of participatory research methodologies. These approaches emphasize the active involvement of research subjects as co-creators of knowledge rather than passive objects of study. Participatory action research, for instance, foregrounds the agency of communities in defining research questions, collecting data, and interpreting results. By doing so, it not only produces knowledge that is more relevant and responsive to the lived realities of marginalized populations, but also functions as a form of empowerment and resistance against epistemic marginalization. This orientation challenges the extractive tendencies of traditional research paradigms, which often treat communities as mere sites for data extraction rather than as partners with valuable insights and expertise. Moreover, the incorporation of indigenous epistemologies into academic discourse exemplifies how alternative knowledge systems can enrich and challenge dominant paradigms. Indigenous ways of knowing often emphasize relationality, interdependence, and a holistic understanding of the world that contrasts sharply with a compartmentalization characteristic of Western scientific traditions. These epistemologies prioritize the interconnectedness of humans, non-human entities, and the environment, recognizing the ethical responsibilities that arise from these relationships. By integrating such perspectives, scholars can develop more nuanced and ethically grounded approaches to addressing contemporary challenges such as environmental degradation, climate change, and social injustice. The challenges of integrating diverse epistemologies are not limited to academia, they also permeate public discourse and policymaking. In the realm of global governance, for instance, international organizations have increasingly recognized the need to incorporate indigenous and local knowledge in environmental and development policies. This recognition stems from the understanding that top-down technocratic solutions often fail to account for the complex social and ecological context in which they are implemented. However, attempts to include alternative knowledges are frequently complicated by power imbalances, linguistic barriers, and differing ontological assumptions. There is a risk that indigenous knowledge may be appropriated or commodified without adequate respect for the communities from which it originates. Hence, genuine epistemic justice requires not only inclusion, but also respect for autonomy, self-determination, and the right to define the terms and conditions of knowledge exchange. Parallel to these developments, the digital age has radically transformed the modalities of knowledge production and dissemination, creating new possibilities as well as new challenges. The proliferation of digital platforms, social media, and open access repositories has democratized access to information and allowed marginalized voices to reach wider audiences. These technologies have facilitated the creation of decentralized knowledge communities that bypass traditional gatekeepers and foster collaborative knowledge creation. Crowdsourcing, citizen science, and online forums exemplify how knowledge production can become more participatory and less hierarchical. However, the digital realm also presents significant risks for the integrity and inclusivity of knowledge. The ease of information dissemination has contributed to the spread of misinformation, disinformation, and epistemic fragmentation. The algorithms that underpin social media platforms often reinforce echo chambers and filter bubbles, limiting exposure to diverse perspectives and deepening polarization. Furthermore, digital divides persist globally with unequal access to technology and internet infrastructure disproportionately affecting marginalized communities. These disparities exacerbate existing epistemic inequalities and highlight the need for critical digital literacy as an essential component of contemporary epistemic justice. The intersection of technology and epistemology raises fundamental questions about authority, credibility, and trust in the digital age. The traditional markers of epistemic authority, such as institutional affiliation, peer review, and scholarly credentials, are increasingly contested and supplemented by new forms of validation, including social endorsement and popularity metrics. While these developments can empower alternative voices, they also complicate the evaluation of knowledge claims and create vulnerabilities to manipulation. The challenge lies in cultivating epistemic virtues, such as open-mindedness, humility, and critical engagement within digital cultures that often prioritize speed, sensationalism, and effective resonance over rigor and reflection. In addressing these challenges, contemporary epistemology must also reckon with the ethical dimensions of knowledge production. Knowledge is never neutral. It is always intertwined with questions of responsibility, justice, and care. This ethical orientation demands that epistemic agents not only seek truth, but also consider the consequences of their knowledge practices for the communities and environments affected. The notion of epistemic responsibility foregrounds the relational and situated character of knowledge, urging scholars and practitioners to be attentive to issues of power, representation, and harm. It also calls for an ethic of repair whereby epistemic wrongs, such as silencing, misrepresentation, or exclusion, are acknowledged and addressed through collaborative and restorative practices. One promising approach to fostering epistemic responsibility is through the cultivation of what has been termed epistemic humility. Epistemic humility involves recognizing the limits of one's own knowledge and being open to learning from others, especially those whose perspectives may differ significantly. This stance counters epistemic arrogance and the often rigid epistemological positions that can inhibit dialogue and mutual understanding. Epistemic humility encourages ongoing reflection on the provisionality of knowledge claims and fosters an environment in which uncertainty and disagreement are seen not as failures, but as opportunities for growth and deeper insight. The ethical imperative to decolonize knowledge production also necessitates the reevaluation of research ethics frameworks. Conventional ethical guidelines largely developed within Western contexts may not adequately capture the complexities of working with diverse communities and knowledge systems. There is a growing recognition of the need to incorporate culturally specific values, participatory decision-making, and equitable benefit sharing into research protocols. This shift underscores the importance of relational ethics, which prioritize respect, reciprocity, and accountability in knowledge practices. In tandem with these ethical considerations, the political stakes of knowledge production remain high. Knowledge can serve as a tool of liberation or domination, empowerment or oppression. This dual potential underscores the need for critical vigilance regarding how knowledge is mobilized in the service of particular interests. The intersection of knowledge and power is particularly evident in contexts such as public health, environmental policy, and social justice movements, where epistemic frameworks shape the possibilities for collective action and transformation. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic starkly revealed the ways in which epistemic authority intersects with political power, social inequalities, and cultural beliefs. The dissemination of scientific knowledge about the virus vaccines and public health measures became entangled with political ideologies, misinformation campaigns, and historical distrust in institutions. The pandemic underscored the necessity of transparent, inclusive, and culturally sensitive knowledge practices that can build trust and foster collective resilience. It also highlighted the importance of acknowledging and addressing epistemic injustice, as marginalized communities often bore the brunt of inadequate representation and harmful assumptions. In this broader context, social movements advocating for racial justice, gender equality, environmental sustainability, and indigenous rights have foregrounded the centrality of epistemic justice in their struggles. These movements challenge dominant narratives and epistemologies demanding recognition of historically silenced voices and alternative ways of knowing. They also insist on the inseparability of epistemic justice from social and political justice, asserting that the democratization of knowledge is a prerequisite for meaningful transformation. Ultimately, the project of rethinking epistemology in light of these diverse critiques and interventions calls for a radical reimagining of what it means to know, to understand, and to engage with the world. It requires moving beyond the quest for certainty and mastery toward an ethos of relationality, openness, and ethical commitment. This reorientation entails recognizing knowledge as a collective, situated, and provisional endeavor that is always subject to revision and contestation. It demands that we embrace complexity, ambiguity, and multiplicity as inherent features of our epistemic landscape. Such a transformation is neither easy nor guaranteed,